300 candles were burning inside Ravenscar Court, and not one of them was burning for joy. Edward Langley, Duke of Fairmont, sat at the head of a ballroom built to hold 300 guests. His chair faced an empty floor, his ears strained for the sound of carriage wheels that never came. Somewhere behind a velvet curtain, a young maid named Lydia Clarke watched a proud man's heart break in complete silence, and she made a decision that no servant in England was permitted to make. She decided that tonight the Duke would not be alone. What she did next would scandalize an empire, terrify a family of schemers, and teach a broken nobleman the difference between people who love a title and the one woman who loved a man. Stay until the end, because the moment she places that gift in his hands is the moment everything changes, and the moment that follows after, beneath the roses of Ravenscar Court, will stay with you long after this story ends. Before we step into Ravenscar Court tonight, welcome to our family of story lovers. If you enjoy slow-burning Duke and Victorian romances filled with heartbreak, quiet courage, and love that crosses every forbidden line, you are exactly where you belong. Please like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which city or country you are watching from tonight. We read every comment, and if we could, we would send each of you a warm cup of tea and a seat by the fire. Now lower the lights, because tonight's story begins with an empty ballroom and ends with a maid standing taller than every duchess in London. Before the accident, Edward Langley had been the kind of man other men envied without shame, and women dreamed of without hope of winning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never once been told no. At 29, he held more land than 3 earls combined, a seat in the House of Lords he rarely needed to raise his voice in, and a smile that had, by the gossip of London drawing rooms, broken at least a dozen hearts before breakfast. He did not chase admiration, it simply followed him, the way morning follows night. Ravenscar Court had been built 200 years earlier by his great-grandfather, a sprawling estate of grey stone and ivy that sat upon a low hill overlooking miles of green Hampshire countryside. Its halls were filled with portraits of stern ancestors, its gardens famous across 3 counties for roses that bloomed even in difficult seasons. Edward had grown up running through those gardens, and as a young duke he had filled them with laughter, with house parties that lasted a week, with the kind of generosity that made servants speak of him fondly, long after they had left his employment. Lydia Clarke had been one of those servants for nearly 2 years before the accident changed everything. She had come to Ravenscar Court at 19, the daughter of a tenant farmer who had died owing more than he owned, leaving Lydia and her younger brother with nothing but a name and a debt. Service was not a calling she had chosen so much as a door that happened to open when she most needed one. She scrubbed floors, mended linens, carried trays up staircases that seemed to multiply the longer she worked there, and she did all of it without complaint, because complaint had never once put bread on a table. What set Lydia apart from the other maids was not ambition. She had none, or so she believed. What set her apart was the way she noticed things. She noticed when the cook was too tired to finish the evening meal and quietly took over the last of the chopping. She noticed when a younger maid was crying in the linen closet and brought her tea without asking why. She noticed, long before anyone spoke of it openly, that the Duke laughed less than he used to, that his eyes lingered too long on letters from his solicitor, that something heavy sat behind his easy charm, even before tragedy gave it a name. The accident happened on a wet October evening, on the road between Ravenscar Court and the nearby village of Aldermere. Edward had been returning from a dinner with friends when his carriage struck a fallen tree limb, hidden by rain and darkness. The horses panicked. The carriage overturned twice, before coming to rest in a ditch. The driver walked away with bruises. Edward did not walk away at all. The physicians who examined him in the weeks that followed used careful words meant to soften an unbearable truth. Damage to the spine, permanent. He would never walk again. Lydia remembered the night he returned to Ravenscar Court from the London hospital, carried through the front doors by 2 footmen, because the wheeled chair had not yet been fitted to the staircases. She remembered the silence that fell over the staff as they watched their employer, once the most vital man any of them had ever served, being lifted like something fragile through his own home. What she remembered most, though, was his face. Not pain. Pain she could have understood. What she saw was something closer to disappearance, as though the man inside the body had quietly stepped away, leaving behind only the shell of who he used to be. The months that followed were a slow unraveling no one at Ravenscar Court spoke of aloud. Letters that once arrived by the dozen from friends in London began to thin, then trickle, then stop altogether. House parties were never proposed again. Invitations to dine elsewhere arrived less and less, and when Edward did attempt to accept one, he would receive, days later, an apologetic note explaining that the engagement had been unexpectedly cancelled. Lydia watched this happen with growing anger she was careful never to show. She watched footmen deliver letters to a man whose hands trembled slightly before he opened them, hoping, every single time, for warmth he no longer received. She watched him sit by the long windows of the library for hours, looking out at gardens he could no longer walk through, his jaw set in the particular way of a man determined not to let anyone see him grieve. She never said much to him in those early months. A servant did not address a duke unless spoken to first, and Edward, in his grief, rarely spoke to anyone at all. But she found small ways to ease what she could. She arranged his books within easier reach before he asked. She made certain his tea was always the precise temperature he preferred, neither too hot to wait for, nor too cool to enjoy. She noticed when his valet was rough in his manner, and quietly suggested, through the housekeeper, that perhaps a gentler hand might serve his grace better. None of it was love. Not yet. It was simply the instinct of a woman who could not stand to watch suffering go unanswered, even suffering that wore a title she would never be permitted to address by its first name. It was nearly 2 years after the accident, on a grey morning in early spring, that the household first heard the rumour that would change everything. Mr. Bennet, the elderly butler who had served 3 generations of the Langley family, called the staff together in the servants' hall with an announcement that made even the most weary scullery maid sit up straight. His Grace intended to host a birthday ball, not a quiet dinner, not a small gathering of remaining friends, a full ball, with musicians, with 300 invitations sent to every duke, earl, countess, politician, and military officer who had ever called Ravenscar Court a place of welcome. Lydia stood near the back of the servants' hall and felt something tighten in her chest that she could not quite name. Hope, perhaps, or fear of hope, which was its own particular ache. She understood, even before anyone said it aloud, exactly what this ball truly was. It was not vanity, it was not indulgence. It was a question Edward Langley was finally brave enough to ask the world that had abandoned him. Does anyone still love the man, or only the duke he used to be? The invitations went out within the week, written in Edward's own careful hand, wherever his strength allowed, sealed with the Fairmont crest he had worn proudly his entire life. Lydia helped carry stacks of them to the post herself, her arms full of paper that felt, somehow, far heavier than it should have. Every single invitation, without exception, received a gracious, warm, entirely polite letter of acceptance. 300 guests confirmed they would attend. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Lydia saw something in Edward Langley's face that she had almost forgotten existed. She remembered, too, a small moment from earlier that same week, one she would later return to often in her memory. She had been carrying a stack of fresh linens past his study when she heard him speaking quietly to himself, rehearsing, she realized, the words he intended to write at the top of each invitation, testing different phrasings as though the precise wording might somehow determine whether anyone chose to come. "My dear friend," he murmured, then paused. "No, Too familiar, perhaps, for those who have not written in months. He tried again. It would bring me great joy. Another pause. Longer this time. Perhaps it would bring me joy enough for both of us. Lydia had stood frozen in the corridor, linens pressed against her chest, listening to a duke quietly doubt whether his own joy was something anyone still wished to witness. She had wanted, fiercely, to walk into that study and tell him that whatever words he chose, his joy mattered, that it had always mattered, long before any accident, and long after. She had not done so. It was not yet her place, she told herself. Not yet. There would be time enough, she reasoned, once the invitations were answered and the candles were lit, and the truth of who still cared for him revealed itself plainly. She did not yet know how cruelly that truth would arrive, nor how completely it would change the shape of her own quiet, careful life. She thought of that moment again now, watching the invitations leave Ravenscar Court in neat, hopeful stacks, and she prayed, more fiercely than she had prayed for anything in her life, that it would not be betrayed. The preparations for the birthday ball consumed Ravenscar Court for nearly 3 weeks. Lydia had never seen the house transform so completely. The great ballroom, unused since before the accident, was stripped of its dust sheets and polished until the marble floor reflected candlelight, like still water. Chandeliers that had not been lit in years were cleaned crystal by crystal. The kitchens worked through the nights, preparing a feast grand enough for visiting royalty, crowned by a 3-tiered birthday cake decorated with gold leaf and sugared roses that took the confectioner 2 full days to complete. Edward oversaw every detail himself, insisting on choices he would once have left entirely to his staff. He selected the wine. He approved the musicians' program twice. He asked, more than once, whether the ballroom doors would be wide enough to allow his chair through with dignity. A question he asked quietly, almost embarrassed, and one that Lydia overheard and never repeated to another living soul. She understood why it mattered so much to him. This was not merely a party. This was Edward Langley standing once more at the center of his own life, refusing to let paralysis be the only thing the world remembered about him. On the morning of the ball itself, Lydia rose before dawn, as she always did, but found she could not settle into her usual tasks. She found herself pausing at windows, watching the long drive that curved up from the main road, half expecting to see the first carriages arrive hours too early out of eagerness. By midday, Ravenscar Court gleamed. Every candle stood ready to be lit. Every chair sat in its precise place. The musicians arrived and tuned their instruments in the music gallery above the ballroom floor. Mr. Bennet moved through the house with the brisk satisfaction of a man overseeing the finest event of his long career. Edward dressed for the evening in a midnight blue coat embroidered with gold thread, a coat his valet had commissioned specifically for the occasion. Lydia caught a glimpse of him being wheeled toward the ballroom that evening, and felt her breath catch despite herself. He looked, in that moment, every inch the Duke London had once adored. Strong-jawed, dark-haired, dressed in quiet splendor, his eyes bright with an anticipation he had not allowed himself to feel in years. She told herself the tightness in her chest was simply happiness for him. She was not entirely honest with herself, even then. The first guests were expected by 7 o'clock. By 6:30, every candle in the ballroom had been lit, casting a warm golden glow across crystal glasses arranged in perfect rows, and silver trays, heavy with delicacies no one had yet touched. Edward took his place at the head of the room, his chair positioned where he could greet each arrival personally, exactly as he had once stood to welcome guests on his own 2 feet. 7 o'clock came. The grand doors of Ravenscar Court stood open, footmen ready at their posts. No carriage appeared. Lydia, stationed near the edge of the ballroom with 2 other maids in case any guest required assistance, watched Edward's expression carefully, the way she had learned to read him over 2 long years. At first, there was no concern at all. Society was rarely punctual. A delay of a quarter hour, meant nothing among people who measured fashionable lateness as a kind of art. By 7:30, the absence of any guest at all had become harder to explain away. By 8 o'clock, Mr. Bennet began quietly checking the drive himself, lantern in hand, peering into the darkness beyond the gates, as though sheer attention might summon a carriage into existence. By 7:30, the long silence outside had become its own kind of presence in the room. Lydia watched Edward's fingers tap once, twice, against the arm of his chair, a habit she had never before seen him allow himself in public. The musicians, sensing something amiss, played more softly, as though lowering their volume might somehow excuse the absence of any dancers. It was nearly 9 when the first letter arrived, delivered by a tired messenger on a tired horse. Mr. Bennet read it at the door, his face carefully arranged into the practiced neutrality of long service, before approaching Edward with measured steps. "Another letter of apology, Your Grace," he said quietly. "Lord Ashworth regrets that a sudden matter of business has detained him in London." Edward nodded once, his expression unreadable, and said simply that the roads were likely difficult this time of year. The second letter arrived 20 minutes later, then a third, then a fourth, each one offered with the same gentle, practiced apology, each one accepted by Edward with the same composed nod, though Lydia watched the muscles along his jaw tighten with every single one. By 10 o'clock, the musicians had stopped playing, uncertain what music suited a room, with no one to dance. The untouched cake sat beneath its candles, the icing beginning to catch faint trails of melted wax. Crystal glasses remained full. The grand ballroom, prepared for 300 souls, held only a duke, his wheeled chair, and a small handful of servants who did not know whether it was crueler to stay or to leave. It was somewhere near 11, in the heaviest silence Lydia had ever stood inside, that she overheard the conversation that explained everything. She had stepped briefly into the corridor outside the ballroom to fetch fresh candles, and there, near the side entrance used by tradesmen and lesser visitors, she found 2 of the household's distant relations speaking in low, careless voices, believing themselves entirely alone. Archibald Langley, Edward's cousin and the man who stood to inherit the title, should Edward die without an heir, was speaking with quiet satisfaction to a companion Lydia did not recognize. "It was simple enough," Archibald said, swirling brandy he had clearly helped himself to from the unattended sideboard. "A word here, a suggestion there. No one wishes to be seen attending a cripple's birthday when there are far more fashionable engagements elsewhere this season. I merely reminded a few key people that their attendance might be misread." His companion laughed softly. "And the Duke believes it is simply bad weather." "Let him believe whatever helps him sleep," Archibald said. "A man who cannot walk cannot exactly chase his own guests down to ask why they never came." Lydia stood frozen in the shadow of the corridor, her hands trembling around the candles she carried, her heart pounding with a fury she had never before felt toward another human being. She wanted, in that moment, to march into that ballroom and tell Edward every word she had heard. She did not. Not yet. She understood, with the clear instinct of someone who had spent 2 years learning to read this particular man, that hearing the truth delivered as gossip from a servant's mouth would humiliate him further, not heal him. So she swallowed her anger, steadied her shaking hands, and returned to the ballroom, carrying her candles and her secret together. By midnight, the last hope had clearly died. The final servants not required to remain began quietly withdrawing, believing, reasonably enough, that a celebration with no guests had no further reason to continue. The housekeeper murmured something to Mr. Bennet about beginning to clear the feast, since nothing in it would survive untouched until morning. Edward sat alone at the head of his ballroom, surrounded by 300 empty chairs, candles burning low, a birthday cake no one had cut, and the particular silence that follows the death of hope. Lydia watched him from the shadows near the far wall, and she understood, with absolute certainty, exactly what he had just learned about every person who had ever called themselves his friend. They had never loved the man at all. They had only ever loved the Duke. Lydia thought of her own father in that moment, a man who had also learned, in his final years, exactly who remained and who vanished once his fortunes failed. She remembered watching neighbors who once borrowed his tools and shared his table crossed to the other side of the lane, rather than greet him after his debts became known publicly. Suffering, she had learned early, was an excellent test of character, though it was a test that almost everyone around Edward had quietly failed that night. She watched him sit motionless among 300 empty chairs and felt something harden inside her chest, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but a fierce, protective resolve she had never before felt toward anyone outside her own family. Whatever happened next, she decided, this man would not finish this night, believing himself entirely unworthy of love. The housekeeper gave the order quietly, the way such orders are always given, when no one wishes to acknowledge the cruelty hiding inside practicality. Clear the table. Extinguish the candles. Let His Grace retire, and let the staff finally rest after a long, wasted night. Two younger maids moved toward the feast table, reaching for the untouched platters, and it was in that exact moment that Lydia Clarke did something she would spend the rest of her life remembering as the bravest thing she had ever done. She stepped forward and said, clearly enough for every servant in the room to hear, "Leave it." The younger maids froze. The housekeeper turned, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief that a maid had spoken without being addressed first. "Lydia," the housekeeper said carefully, "His Grace has had a difficult enough evening. There is no kindness in leaving him to look at. There is no kindness in pretending nothing happened either," Lydia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Leave the table exactly as it is." She did not wait for permission. She crossed the ballroom floor, her footsteps echoing across marble, built for 300 dancing couples, and she began relighting the candles that had started to gutter, one by one, her hands moving with quiet determination. Edward watched her from his chair, his face caught somewhere between exhaustion and confusion. "Lydia," he said softly, "there is no need. Let the staff retire." "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, not looking up from the candle she was lighting, "but I find I am not yet ready to retire." It was, by every rule of Victorian service, an extraordinary thing to say. A maid did not contradict her employer. A maid did not decide, of her own will, what an evening required. But something in Lydia's chest had cracked open that night, watching cruelty disguised as bad luck, and she found she no longer cared as much as she should have about rules built to keep people exactly where society believed they belonged. She finished relighting the candles until the table glowed once more in warm gold light, the untouched cake gleaming beneath its rosettes as though the evening had simply paused rather than died. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small package, wrapped carefully in plain brown paper and tied with a length of dark blue ribbon she had purchased specifically because it matched, she had thought privately, the exact color of his eyes. She had spent nearly 6 months of her wages on what lay inside, money she could not easily spare, money that might have gone toward repairs to her brother's cottage or toward the small savings she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard for emergencies she prayed would never come. She had told herself, when she purchased it, that it was simply a kindness owed to an employer who had endured more than his share of suffering. She understood now, holding it toward him with trembling hands, that it had always been something more than that. "I know it is not my place," she said quietly, "but I could not bear to let tonight end with nothing given to you at all." Edward looked at the package, then at her, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and accepted it, his fingers brushing briefly against hers, in a touch neither of them acknowledged aloud, though both felt it linger far longer than propriety allowed. Inside the wrapping was a leather-bound journal, its cover soft and dark, The kind of object meant to be used for years, not glanced at once and forgotten. On the very first page, in Lydia's careful handwriting, she had written words she had practiced for nearly a week before finding the courage to set them down permanently. Your Grace, titles may command respect, but kindness earns remembrance. Tonight, I choose to remember the man. Edward read the words twice. Lydia watched something shift behind his eyes, a crack appearing in the careful composure he had maintained through every apologetic letter that evening. He did not speak for a long moment, and when he finally did, his voice was rougher than usual. "No one else gave me anything tonight," he said quietly. "Not one gift, not one guest." "Then perhaps," Lydia said, gathering courage from some place she did not entirely recognize within herself, "Your Grace will permit me to be your guest instead." The ballroom had gone utterly silent. Mr. Bennet stood near the doorway, the housekeeper beside him, both watching with expressions caught between alarm and something neither wished to name. No servant addressed a duke this way. No maid asked to sit as an equal at her employer's table. Every unspoken rule of the world they lived in stood quietly screaming that this should not be happening. "If your Grace will permit it," Lydia said softly, her chin lifted despite the trembling she felt in her knees. "May I be your birthday guest tonight?" The silence stretched long enough that Lydia feared she had finally gone too far, that she would be dismissed from Ravenscar Court before sunrise, with nothing to show for 6 months of carefully saved wages, but a journal he might never open again. Then Edward Langley did something none of the assembled staff expected. He laughed. Not the polished, practiced laugh he had offered guests in years past, but something rougher, more genuine, a sound that seemed to surprise even himself as it left his throat. "Mr. Bennet," he said, still looking at Lydia, "fetch a chair for Miss Clarke, and bring the cake knife. It appears I finally have someone willing to celebrate with me." What followed was perhaps the strangest birthday celebration Ravenscar Court had ever witnessed. Lydia cut the first slice of cake herself, placing it before Edward with the same careful reverence she might have shown a queen. She lit a fresh candle, when the others burned too low, and at Edward's quiet, almost shy insistence, she invited the remaining staff, the ones who had not yet retired, to join them at the table, not as servants awaiting instruction, but as guests, sharing in whatever small joy the night could still offer. No one had ever seen such boundaries broken inside those walls. And yet, watching Edward Langley smile for the first time in nearly 2 years, not one person in that room found the courage or the desire to stop it. Later that night, after the last candle had finally been allowed to burn itself out, and the staff had at last retired to their own quarters, the housekeeper found Lydia in the narrow servants' corridor and stopped her with a hand upon her arm. "What you did tonight," the housekeeper said quietly, "could have ended your position here. You understand that?" "I understand it," Lydia said, "and you would do it again." It was not truly a question, and Lydia did not answer it as one. "I would do it again tomorrow, and every night after, if it meant he did not have to sit alone in a room built for joy, and find only silence instead." The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, something softening in her usually stern expression. "Be careful, Lydia," she said finally. "Kindness such as yours has a way of growing into something this house was never built to permit." Lydia said nothing to that, because she already suspected, with a quiet certainty she was not yet ready to examine too closely, that the housekeeper's warning had arrived several weeks too late. In the weeks that followed the disastrous ball, something quietly shifted inside Ravenscar Court that no one announced but everyone noticed. Edward began asking for Lydia by name when he required assistance arranging his books, though his valet was perfectly capable of the task. He began lingering in the library in the evenings rather than retiring early, knowing she often passed through to tend the fire before the household settled for the night. Lydia told herself, in those early weeks, that nothing had truly changed. She was simply performing her duties with slightly more attention than before. She did not examine too closely why she found herself choosing the library route even when her tasks did not strictly require it, or why she found her heart quickening whenever she heard the particular creak of his wheeled chair crossing the polished wood floor toward whichever room she occupied. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after the ball, that Edward made a discovery that altered everything between them. He had asked her to help locate a particular ledger among his late father's papers, documents that had not been disturbed in years, and in sorting through them, his fingers brushed against a small bundle of torn fragments, carefully repaired with thread and glue, fragments that had once been the corner of a family portrait, the one depicting his late mother, which he had believed permanently ruined after a careless footman knocked it against a doorframe 2 winters past. "This was destroyed," he said slowly, turning the repaired fragment over in his hands. "I remember. The frame cracked the canvas beyond saving. I was told it could not be mended." Lydia's silence answered the question before she could find words to avoid it. "You repaired it," Edward said, looking at her now with an intensity that made her wish, briefly, that she could disappear into the bookshelves behind her. "It seemed a small enough thing," she said quietly. "Your mother's portrait. I could not bear for it to simply be discarded." "How long?" Edward asked, his voice low. "Have you been protecting things in this house without my knowledge?" She might have deflected the question. She had deflected so many similar moments over the past 2 years, quietly correcting cruelty before it reached him, quietly dismissing a footman who had once mocked his condition within earshot of other servants, quietly intercepting gossip that traveled faster through Ravenscar Court than anyone above stairs ever realized. But something in his expression, some rawness she rarely saw him allow, made her answer honestly. "Since shortly after the accident," she admitted, "there was a footman who spoke unkindly of your condition to the kitchen staff. I asked Mr. Bennet to dismiss him before the words could reach you. There was talk among some of the visiting tradesmen, cruel talk, and I made certain it never traveled beyond the kitchen doors. I did not do these things because it was required of me, Your Grace. I did them because I could not bear to watch you suffer wounds you did not even know existed." Edward was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not entirely name. Why, he finally asked, would a maid concern herself so deeply with the dignity of a man who could offer her nothing in return? Lydia considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps," she said, "I did not concern myself with the Duke at all. Perhaps I simply could not stand by while a good man was made to feel unworthy of kindness." It was, perhaps, the most honest thing either of them had said to the other since the night of the ball, and it settled between them with a weight neither was entirely prepared to carry. The weeks that followed brought a kind of companionship neither of them had words for, though both felt its presence growing daily. Evenings in the library became a quiet ritual, Lydia reading aloud from volumes of poetry, while Edward listened with his eyes closed, occasionally correcting her pronunciation of some obscure Latin phrase, with the particular pleasure of a man who enjoyed, for the first time in years, being gently teased in return. "You read Byron as though you suspect him of exaggeration," Edward observed one evening, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "I suspect every poet of exaggeration, Your Grace," Lydia replied without looking up from the page. "It is generally how they earn their living." Mr. Bennet, who had served the family long enough to recognize the particular danger and beauty of what was unfolding before him, took to offering dry, understated observations whenever he passed through rooms the two of them occupied. "It is curious," he remarked once to the housekeeper, loudly enough that both Edward and Lydia might overhear, "how aristocratic etiquette insists a duke must never laugh too freely. And yet here we are, witnessing precisely that, twice in 1 week." On another occasion, when Edward insisted he required no help selecting which waistcoat suited a particular dinner with his solicitor, only to emerge wearing 2 entirely mismatched buttons fastened in the wrong order, Mr. Bennet simply observed, with perfect composure, that his Grace had clearly developed a bold new fashion of his own invention, one the elderly butler felt confident would not catch on among the wider aristocracy. Lydia had been forced to excuse herself from the room entirely, to keep from laughing in front of him, and Edward, catching sight of her shaking shoulders through the half-open door, had called after her that her discretion left a great deal to be desired. These small moments of warmth and humor did nothing to diminish the deeper current building quietly beneath them. There were afternoons when Lydia served tea and felt Edward's fingers linger against hers, a heartbeat longer than necessary, as he accepted the cup. There were evenings when Edward, against his own fierce independence, found himself asking Lydia to remain a few minutes longer after her duties had technically ended, offering no real reason, beyond a quiet admission that he simply preferred the sound of her voice to silence. Lydia began to notice, with growing unease, that she thought of him constantly, even during hours she should have devoted entirely to her work. She caught herself imagining his laugh during idle moments scrubbing floors. She found herself selecting which poems to read aloud, not for their literary merit, but for whether they might make him smile. She understood, with the particular dread of someone glimpsing a cliff edge through fog, exactly what was happening to her heart, and she understood, too, that no amount of careful denial would change the simple, terrifying truth of it. There was an afternoon, not long after the discovery of the repaired portrait, when Edward insisted, against every protest his valet and his own stubborn pride could offer, that he required no assistance navigating the narrow turn near the conservatory steps. Lydia watched from a respectful distance as his chair caught against an uneven flagstone, tilting dangerously before he managed, through sheer determined effort, to right it himself. "You see," he said, breathless but triumphant, refusing to look in her direction. Perfectly capable of nearly toppling into Mrs. Whitfield's prized ferns," Lydia replied, already moving forward to steady the chair, regardless of his protests. "I shall inform the gardener you have volunteered to replace them yourself, Your Grace, given your evident skill with delicate things." Edward laughed. The sound startled out of him before he could stop it, and the two of them remained there a moment longer than necessary, her hand still resting lightly upon the back of his chair, neither quite willing to be the first to step away. A maid could not love a duke. The thought arrived again and again, unwelcome and unrelenting, every time she allowed herself even a moment's daydream. Society offered no path forward for feelings such as these, no respectable conclusion, nothing but ruin, should anyone discover the truth, growing quietly between them. And yet, lying awake in her narrow servant's bed each night, Lydia found she could no longer convince her own heart to listen to reason. It became their habit, as spring deepened into early summer, to walk together through the gardens at sunrise, Lydia pushing Edward's chair along paths lined with the famous Ravenscar roses, their conversation drifting easily between idle observation and confessions neither had planned to make. It was during one such morning, the air still cool with dew, the roses heavy with color along the garden walls, that Edward finally spoke the truth he had carried since the night of the ball. "Everyone believes the accident broke me," he said quietly, watching the path ahead rather than her face. "They are wrong. I survived the accident. I survived learning to live in this chair. What very nearly destroyed me was standing in that ballroom, hour after hour, realizing that not one person I had called a friend for 30 years cared enough to walk through my door." Lydia stopped pushing the chair and came to stand beside him instead, kneeling so that her eyes met his directly, rather than from behind. "They came for your title," she said softly. "I came because you are Edward." The words settled over both of them like something sacred. Edward reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and for the first time since the accident, he allowed tears he had refused to shed, even in his darkest private hours. Lydia did not look away from his grief. She held his hand and let him weep, understanding instinctively that this moment required witness, not solutions, presence rather than platitudes. When at last he composed himself, he studied her face with an expression of such open vulnerability that her own breath caught in her chest. "I have spent 2 years believing I was unworthy of anyone's true affection," he said, and then a maid with nothing but a journal and 6 months of saved wages walked into my ballroom and proved me entirely wrong. You were never unworthy, Lydia said fiercely. You were simply surrounded by people too shallow to recognize what they were losing. It was months later, on another sunrise walk through the same rose garden, that the careful distance both had maintained between friendship and something deeper finally dissolved entirely. Lydia had been speaking, somewhat nervously, attempting to explain away the warmth she felt whenever she was near him, insisting that whatever she felt could never be permitted to grow into anything more than devoted service, that she understood perfectly well the impossible gulf between a duke and a maid, that she would never wish to embarrass him by allowing her heart to wander somewhere it had no right to travel. Edward reached out and gently stopped her mid-sentence, lifting her trembling hand in both of his own. He did not kiss it immediately. Instead, he studied her, his eyes moving over her face with an expression of such quiet wonder that Lydia felt her pulse race beneath her skin, every nerve suddenly, achingly aware of his nearness, of the warmth of his hands around hers, of the particular hunger that had been building quietly between them for months, and finally found itself with nowhere left to hide. "Lydia," he said softly, "I have spent every day since that birthday, searching every room I enter, for your presence before I can convince myself to be at ease. I do not believe that is the behavior of a man who considers you merely his servant." "Edward," she whispered, his given name leaving her lips for the first time, fragile and forbidden, and utterly thrilling all at once. "You must understand what it would cost us both if anyone discovered—" "I understand precisely what it would cost," he said, his voice low and steady. "I find I no longer care to measure my life by what society permits me to feel." Slowly, with a reverence that made her breath catch entirely, he lifted her gloved hand and pressed a long, lingering kiss against her knuckles. Their eyes remained locked the entire time, neither willing to look away, the moment stretching with a tension so thick it felt almost unbearable, every restrained longing of the past months gathering itself into that single point of contact between his lips and her trembling hand. Nothing improper passed between them, no word crossed the careful boundaries Victorian propriety demanded, and yet Lydia felt, in that single suspended moment beneath the blooming roses, as though every barrier the world had built between them had quietly crumbled to nothing. She understood, walking back toward Ravenscar Court that morning, with her heart pounding and her skin still warm from his touch, that there would be no retreating from what had just been spoken between them, however silently it had been spoken. She thought of her mother, long dead, who had once told her that love rarely announced itself with grand declarations, but instead arrived quietly, in the small accumulating moments a person almost failed to notice until they had already changed everything. Lydia understood now exactly what her mother had meant. It had not been a single instant that delivered her into love with Edward Langley. It had been 100 small mornings, 100 shared books, 100 glances exchanged across crowded rooms, each one adding its quiet weight until the truth simply became impossible to deny any longer. She was in love with the Duke of Fairmont. In the days that followed that morning beneath the roses, Lydia found herself caught in a delicious, terrifying suspension between fear and longing. Every glance Edward sent her across a crowded room felt charged with a meaning neither of them dared speak aloud in the presence of others. Every accidental touch, a hand brushing hers as she arranged his books, the warmth of his fingers when she helped steady his chair along an uneven path, sent a current through her she had never before experienced and could not fully name, though her body understood it, long before her mind permitted the word. There were evenings when Edward would request her company in the library long after the rest of the household had retired, and the two of them would sit in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional turn of a page, both acutely aware of how close they sat, how easily a hand might reach for another across the small distance between their chairs, how neither of them quite trusted themselves to close that distance, and yet neither wished, with every fiber of their being, to widen it. I find myself thinking of you at the most inconvenient hours, Edward admitted one such evening, his voice low, almost reluctant, as though the confession had escaped him before he could properly guard it. During meetings with my solicitor, while reviewing tenant accounts. Even, I confess, during sermons I am meant to be attending with rather more solemnity. That is a grave admission, Your Grace, Lydia said, fighting to keep her own voice steady, despite the warmth spreading through her chest. I shall have to inform the vicar that his sermons compete poorly against a housemaid. They compete against nothing at all, Edward said quietly, turning to look at her fully now, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There is no contest, Lydia. There has not been one for some time. She did not trust herself to respond. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, heavy with everything neither of them had yet permitted themselves to say plainly, both achingly aware that whatever line remained between propriety and desire had grown thinner with every passing week, and that one of them, eventually, would have to decide whether to cross it. And from the warmth in his eyes as he watched her walk beside him, she understood, with both terror and wonder, that he was equally lost to her. It did not take long for whispers to find their way to London. Servants' talk, even the most loyal among them, and a single careless remark from a visiting tradesman about the unusual closeness between the Duke of Fairmont and his maid, was all that was required to set the gossip mills of polite society turning. Archibald Langley heard the rumours within a fortnight, and he understood immediately what they threatened. Should Edward ever marry beneath his station, or worse, should scandal so thoroughly disgrace the Fairmont name that the title itself came under question, Archibald's careful positioning as the most likely heir could unravel entirely. He arrived at Ravenscar Court, uninvited, on a grey afternoon in early autumn, his expression carrying the particular smoothness of a man who believed himself entirely in control of the conversation he was about to begin. "Cousin," he said, settling into a chair across from Edward's without waiting to be invited to sit, "I have heard concerning talk in London. Talk regarding your maid. Miss Clarke," Edward said evenly, "has done nothing to warrant concern. Has she not?" Archibald's smile did not reach his eyes. "A servant who has somehow positioned herself at the center of your daily life, who accompanies you on private walks, who, I am told, addressed you by your given name within earshot of household staff. Edward, surely you recognize how this appears to anyone outside these walls." "I recognize," Edward said, his voice hardening, "that you are the same man who quietly convinced 300 guests to abandon my birthday celebration rather than be seen near a duke who could no longer walk." The accusation landed precisely as intended. Archibald's composure flickered, just briefly, before he recovered it. "I do not know what you imagine you have learned," he said carefully, "but I will not be lectured on loyalty by a man entertaining a romance with his own housemaid. Get out of my home, Archibald. Think carefully before you dismiss me so easily," Archibald said, rising slowly. "I have already begun making inquiries regarding Miss Clarke's family, her late father's debts, certain irregularities that might prove rather inconvenient should they reach the wrong ears. A scandal involving a servant manipulating a vulnerable, grieving duke would ruin her far more thoroughly than it could ever touch you." The threat hung in the air long after Archibald had departed, and Edward spent the remainder of that day in a silence so heavy that even Mr. Bennet dared not interrupt it. That evening, Edward summoned Lydia to the library, his expression carrying a weight she had never before seen settle across his features. "Archibald has discovered us," he said simply. "He intends to use whatever he can find against your family's name to force you from this house, and to discredit anything that has grown between us as manipulation rather than love." Lydia felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. "What will you do?" "I am asking myself the same question," Edward admitted. "I could send you away quietly, protect your reputation by ending this before it can be twisted into scandal. It would be the safer path, the expected path." "And the other path?" Lydia asked quietly, though she already feared she knew the answer he was building toward. "The other path requires me to choose you publicly," Edward said, "regardless of what it costs my title, my standing, or my family's expectations. I find, examining my own heart honestly, that I no longer wish to protect a reputation built upon people who abandoned me the moment I needed them most." Lydia crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers. "Edward, I do not wish to be the reason you lose everything you have spent your life building. You are not the reason I might lose anything," he said firmly. "Archibald and his schemes are the reason. You, Lydia Clarke, are the reason I have anything left worth protecting at all." In the days that followed, Archibald did exactly as he had threatened. He sent agents to the village of Lydia's birth, men who asked careful questions about her late father's debts, about whether any creditor might be persuaded to bring a public claim against the family name that could be twisted into scandal. He spread quiet word among his own circle that the Duke of Fairmont had fallen victim to a scheming servant who had exploited a grieving, vulnerable man for her own advancement. Mr. Bennet, upon learning of these inquiries, came to Edward with information of his own, gathered quietly through the network of household staff who trusted him completely. "Your Grace," he said, "I have learned that Mr. Archibald has accumulated considerable gambling debts of his own in London, debts he has concealed from the rest of the family. Perhaps it is worth recalling that a man so eager to expose others' weaknesses often does so to distract attention from his own." Edward considered this information carefully, and rather than using it as a weapon, he chose instead a quieter, more decisive path. He summoned his solicitor and arranged with deliberate care to settle the entirety of Lydia's late father's outstanding debts himself, removing the one vulnerability Archibald had hoped to exploit. He then wrote, in his own hand, a letter to every relation who might be inclined to listen to Archibald's gossip, stating plainly his complete confidence in Miss Clarke's character and warning, with the quiet authority of a duke who had nothing left to lose, that any further attempt to slander her would be met with consequences he would not hesitate to pursue through every legal means available to him. Lydia learned of these actions only after they were already complete, and when she confronted him about the debt he had quietly settled, her voice trembling with a mixture of gratitude and fierce independence, Edward simply took her hand and said, "I did not do it to purchase your affection, Lydia. I did it because no woman who has spent 2 years protecting my dignity should spend one more night fearing for her family's name." Lydia wept then, openly, the careful composure she had maintained through every hardship of her life finally giving way, and Edward simply held her hand and let her, understanding instinctively, as she once had for him, that some moments require only presence and patience rather than words. When she had recovered herself enough to speak again, she asked the question that had quietly troubled her since Archibald's visit. "What becomes of us, Edward, if society never forgives this? If every door in London remains closed to us regardless of what you have done to silence Archibald?" Edward considered this honestly, refusing to offer comfort he did not entirely believe. "Some doors may indeed remain closed," he admitted, "but I have already learned, rather painfully, exactly how much those particular doors were worth. I would rather spend my life behind closed doors with you than continue chasing open ones that lead only to empty rooms." Edward announced, within the month, that he intended to host a second birthday celebration at Ravenscar Court, precisely 1 year after the first. The decision sent fresh waves of gossip through London, most of society assuming the Duke intended a quiet reconciliation with the friends who had abandoned him the previous year, an opportunity for everyone involved to politely forget the embarrassment of the first failed ball. Invitations went out once again, and once again every single recipient accepted with gracious enthusiasm, eager, this time, to be seen reconciling with a man whose continued wealth and influence still mattered a great deal, whatever they privately thought of his condition. The night of the ball arrived with Ravenscar Court, transformed once more into its full glittering splendor. This time, however, every carriage that approached the long drive actually delivered its passengers to the front doors. The ballroom filled steadily through the evening with the same dukes, earls, ladies, and officers who had so thoroughly abandoned Edward 1 year earlier, all of them arriving with polished smiles and carefully rehearsed apologies about prior misunderstandings and unfortunate timing. Lydia stood near the edge of the ballroom in a position of quiet dignity Mr. Bennet had specifically arranged for her, no longer hidden among the serving staff, but present as an honored guest, a decision Edward had insisted upon, despite the raised eyebrows it produced among the assembled nobility. When the musicians finally paused and the room settled into expectant silence, Edward had himself wheeled to the center of the ballroom floor, and the crowd gathered close, anticipating gracious words of reconciliation. 1 year ago, Edward began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. I stood in this very ballroom, surrounded by 300 empty chairs, waiting for guests who had every one of you among them. Guests who had each personally accepted my invitation, and not a single one of whom arrived. A visible unease rippled through the assembled crowd. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and somewhere near the refreshment table, a countess who had once written Edward the warmest of apologetic letters suddenly found great interest in studying her own gloves. I will not pretend tonight that this wound has fully healed, Edward continued, but I have learned something this past year that I believe is worth far more than any apology you might now offer me. I learned that titles, wealth, and influence attract a great many people willing to call themselves friends, but they attract almost no one willing to remain present when those things are stripped away. He paused, his eyes finding Lydia across the room. On that night, when every single one of you chose to stay away, exactly one person in this entire household refused to let me face my birthday alone. She relit my candles after others had begun extinguishing them. She defied the strict rules of her own position to sit beside me as a guest rather than a servant. She gave me a gift purchased with nearly 6 months of her wages, when none of you, with all your wealth, thought to send so much as a card. The room had gone utterly silent now, every eye following the direction of Edward's gaze, toward the young woman standing quietly near the edge of the floor. Her name is Lydia Clarke, Edward said, his voice steady and clear, and her loyalty that night carried more true nobility than every title gathered in this room combined. I would rather spend the remainder of my life honoring the woman who chose to stay than continue pretending to value the approval of those who so easily chose to leave. The silence that followed was the kind that settles permanently into memory, the kind every guest present would describe for years afterward whenever the story of that night was retold across London drawing rooms. Archibald, standing near the back of the crowd, felt every carefully constructed scheme collapse in that single public moment. There would be no scandal to manufacture now, no whispered accusation of manipulation that could survive a duke's own public declaration of gratitude and love, delivered before 300 witnesses. Lydia crossed the ballroom floor slowly, every step watched by an audience that, 1 year earlier, had not cared enough to watch her employer's heart break in an empty room. She knelt beside Edward's chair, took his hand, and allowed him, before all of them, to lift her hand and press a kiss upon it, exactly as he had once done beneath the roses. Except this time, there was no need for secrecy, no fear of discovery, nothing left to hide. The woman once dismissed in this house as only a maid, Edward said quietly, for her alone to hear, though several nearby guests caught the words regardless, has become the only person I have ever known whose presence I trust without question. Within a year, Lydia Clarke became Lydia Langley, Duchess of Fairmont, in a ceremony far smaller and far warmer than the grand spectacle her title might have suggested, attended by household staff who had watched the entire story unfold, by Mr. Bennet, who wept openly despite his usual composure, and by a small handful of true friends who had proven, through years of quiet loyalty rather than fashionable attendance, that they deserved a place in Edward's life. Ravenscar Court continued hosting birthday celebrations every year that followed, each one filled with genuine warmth rather than obligation, each one a quiet reminder of the night an entire ballroom stood empty, and one maid's courage proved that true devotion had never required a title at all.
In later years, when their own children asked how their parents had fallen in love, Edward would tell the story of an empty ballroom and 300 unburned candles, and Lydia would tell the story of a journal bought with 6 months of careful savings.
Neither version was ever quite complete without the other, and neither of them ever tired of telling it, even decades later, even long after London society had entirely forgotten the scandal of a duke who married his maid, remembering instead only the quiet, undeniable truth that had outlasted every whispered objection. Love, Ravenscar Court's old stones, seemed to whisper through every season that followed, had never once asked permission from anyone's title. It had simply waited, patiently, for someone brave enough to walk through an open door when everyone else had chosen to stay away. And on quiet evenings, long after the candles of that second ball had burned down to nothing, visitors to Ravenscar Court would sometimes ask the elderly Duchess how she had found the courage, as a young maid with nothing to her name, to defy every rule of her station for a man she was never meant to love. Lydia would simply smile, the same quiet smile she had worn the night she first lit those candles, and say that courage had felt, at the time, like nothing more than refusing to let a good man believe himself unworthy of kindness. Everything else, she would add, had simply followed from there. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of tonight's story. We hope Edward and Lydia's journey reminded you that real love is never measured by status, but by who chooses to stay when everything else falls away. If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe for more Duke and Victorian-era romances, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Lydia's place that night. We read every single comment, and we are deeply grateful you spent this time with us. Until our next story, take care of yourselves, and never underestimate the quiet courage of someone who simply refuses to let you face your darkest hour alone.